How did I talk for 40 minutes about Jane Austen? Well, that's a silly question. Hello everybody, my name is Kelsey and we're about to get very, very nerdy with my Jane Austen inspired collection. So it is no secret, literally no secret, on the channel that I love Jane Austen. I love her books. I love her person. She's amazing. Because of that, I have quite a few books on my shelves that have been inspired by her work. Now, I don't have a very large collection of her books. I mean, I've got a good number of them, but I have a good amount of books that have been inspired by her work or are about her in some way. So I thought that I would show you guys my physical collection. I know there are definitely a few on my Kindle, but I don't even know what they are anymore, and I do not feel like going through my Kindle to figure it out. So we're doing the ones that I physically own. So if you're someone who likes the ideas or the plots sound interesting to you, but you're not a huge fan of kind of the older writing style, classic writing style, this is your video. I was going to show you what I have on my list or on my shelves. I've read most of them, I think, but I have no idea. So let's get into things that have been inspired by her work. I'm specifically doing fiction books. I'm not going to go into the nonfiction books I own because those are just about her or her books, but these are things that have been inspired by her. So I can't start this video any other way than talking about these books. So these don't actually go together. Actually, I think these three are a series, but I put this one with it, and these are ridiculousness, basically. And that is Pride and Prejudice and Zombies. This obviously is Pride and Prejudice, but if zombies existed. Then we also have Sense and Sensibility and Sea Monsters, which is quite literally just the story of Sense and Sensibility, but if they live under the sea and there are monsters. But then there's a couple other books that are part of the zombie series. We've got Dreadfully Ever After, which is a sequel to Pride and Prejudice and Zombies, and then we've also got Dawn of the Dreadfuls, which is kind of a prequel to Pride and Prejudice and Zombies. So it follows our characters, just not the story, whereas these two follow the story. The writers have quite literally taken the original work of Jane Austen and just gone in and tweaked it. So a lot of these will sound familiar if you're a huge fan of Jane Austen, but if you like just ridiculous Regency England type of stories with things that there's no way exist, like zombies, this is your book. They're just fun. There's no thought process to them. They're just fun. And these, I'm pretty sure this is the first book that I ever read that was inspired by something by Jane Austen, I think. But yeah, I love them. So it felt appropriate to start off this video with these. I've read these two. I have not read the sequel and prequel to the zombie book, but they're just fun. So the next two are actually kind of mystery books surrounding Jane Austen, and the first one is one I've actually read, which is The Phantom of Pemberley by Regina Jeffers. This is what it sounds like. It's a murder mystery that takes place at Pemberley. It follows Darcy and Elizabeth, I believe it's a year after they've been married, and it's just this author's kind of reimagining of the characters. You get a very dark mystery surrounding these people. Basically, the whole plot around this is you've got characters you know like Darcy, Elizabeth, Georgiana, Catherine, and Anne de Bourgh, and then you've got characters that have been completely made up for the story, and they all get trapped at Pemberley because of a storm, and then people start dying, and they're trying to figure out what's going on. And there's this rumor that there's a phantom at Pemberley, and so everyone in the surrounding areas is kind of freaking out, and Darcy and Lizzie are trying to figure out what is going on. So it's a murder mystery, but it does get dark at times, so I would be wary of that. Check trigger warnings. There's a lot of stuff that has to do with mental health, especially near the end, that I'm not sure is handled quite well, but I don't know from experience, so I can't say. But it's an interesting book. Go check out my wrap-up if you would like to know more. But it's a mystery, and it's about Pemberley. The next one is actually The Mysterious Death of Miss Jane Austen by Lindsay Ashford. So Jane Austen died relatively early. I believe she was in her early 40s, if I remember correctly, and this story basically is the idea of if it wasn't natural. So we follow, what's her name? Anne Sharp, who is supposed to be the former governess of the Austen family. I don't know if this is a real character or a made-up character. I'm feeling like it's a made-up character. It's been around the family forever, and so this is kind of her telling her story of like what actually happened to Jane Austen and the Austen family, and it's supposed to have shocking secrets, forbidden loves, and maybe even murder. Ooh, but this just sounds like a lot of fun. The next one is one that I also haven't read quite yet, but I'm very excited and plan on reading it sometime this year, and that is Mary B. by Catherine J. Chen. This kind of explores Mary during the events of Pride and Prejudice as well as after the events of Pride and Prejudice, and I believe she possibly has a love story in this book. I'm not entirely sure, but Mary deserves her due. All of the other sisters, besides maybe Kitty, has gotten something. Even Kitty had more page time than Mary did. She was just there. And so she fascinates me as a character. I want to know more about her. So I'm very excited to get into this one at some point. Because, like, come on, she deserves something. The next book that I have to talk about is Pride by E.B. Zaboy. This one I actually read, I believe, somewhere in the middle of last year. This is a modernized retelling of Pride and Prejudice, and it's one of my favorites. This basically takes place in New York City during the time of like regentrification, and our main girl's, the Lizzie character, in her neighborhood. And the Darcy family moves in next door in one of the kind of like newer buildings because they have quite a lot of money, and it's the two of them clashing. So it's quite literally a remixed contemporary version of Pride and Prejudice, but it is so well done. I loved this book so much. There's so many great things about this where it is very much its own work, as well as it's got a lot of hints to the original text as well. So if you like the idea of Pride and Prejudice but you don't want to read the classic, I would go with this one. This is a good adaptation, reimagining. The next one I have to talk about is Jane of Austen by Hilary Manton Lodge. This one I've also read, and this is kind of a reimagining of Sense and Sensibility, but it's contemporary and modernized. This one was not my favorite. I believe I gave it 3 stars because this is quite literally rehashing the original story without too much kind of reimagining of it. You just kind of take the same situations, the same characters, and plop them in modern time. So if you like the idea of Sense and Sensibility, this is probably your closest to the original because it's quite literally the same plot line. It has to do with musicians in Texas. It was cute. I believe it is self-published or indie published, so it was nice to give that author some love, and it was very well done. It also has some really cool, because they own a tea shop, and every chapter it ends with a kind of what's the recipe for either tea or a baked good. So like if you like tea, oh, you're gonna get so many good recipes out of this book. So the next one is more of a inspired by Jane Austen rather than a reimagining of one of her works, and that is the Jane Austen Marriage Manual by Kim Izzo. I haven't actually read this one yet, but it follows our main character Kate, who is literally obsessed with Jane Austen, and she, at first everything is going okay in her life, and then like everything goes wrong. And her friends have either gifted before this book or relatively earlier on in this book have gifted her land in Scotland, and so she has to take a bunch of freelance jobs to make ends meet. Basically, she has to write an article with the question, inspired by Austen, is in the toughest economic times, is a wealthy man the only must-have accessory? So she goes to Scotland and I'm sure finds a lord, and it's a romance about that. So it's more inspired by the idea of Austen and the idea of the wealthy man being like the most important thing. But it sounds cool, and I love romances, and anything inspired by Austen makes me happy. Okay, the next one is like my favorite, all-time favorite, inspiration, remix, whatever you want to call it, and that is Eligible by Curtis Sittenfeld. This is a modernized retelling of Pride and Prejudice. Yes, there's a lot of those. This is my favorite. It's got all the same characters, it's set in a modernized world, but there's quite a few twists on it. It kind of has a bachelor story element to it as well, and it's just fun. I love it so much. I love the writing. I love the characters. The chapters are like 1 or 2 pages. There's like 150 chapters in this tiny little book. So you can get through it really, really quickly. I read this a couple years ago and it's still like in my brain. It's so great. So if you want a modernized hate to love Pride and Prejudice retelling, I highly recommend this one. This is an adult one. Pride is more of a YA one. They're both great. The next one is more of a companion book rather than like a book, and that is The Secret Diary of Lizzie Bennet. This is based on the YouTube show The Lizzie Bennet Diaries, which is based on Pride and Prejudice. So there's a whole lot of stuff there. But for those of you who don't know, The Lizzie Bennet Diaries is an amazing, incredibly, I love it so much. It is a web series on YouTube that you can watch for free. I'll leave the link down below if you're curious. It's got like 100 episodes in it, and it's the story of Pride and Prejudice, but it's set in a modernized retelling. It's set in the style of Lizzie is in, I believe she's doing her master's in communication, and she's created this YouTube vlog style sit-down video where she's kind of telling about her life, and so we see all of the normal Pride and Prejudice stuff through that. And this is just like the diary that accompanies it. It's really cool because you get into the idea and you get more into the characters and you see some of the stuff that happens that didn't happen on screen, but Lizzie talks about on screen. So this was just really fun. I loved it. I feel like you have to have watched the series to really care about this, because there are some things that like she doesn't even explain in here, but like if you've seen the show, you know. It's just a fun adaptation. I really enjoyed it. But again, you have to have seen the TV series. The next one I have not read, but it is yet another Pride and Prejudice retelling. Do I have a theme? I think so. This is Pride and Prejudice and Other Flavors by Sonali Dev. I know that she, I believe it's a she, has 2 more books out, one based on Sense and Sensibility and one based on Persuasion. I know one of those is relatively new, like came out this year. I don't remember which one it is. But this is basically Pride and Prejudice, but set in an Indian American family. Sounds great. I'm very excited. I know it has to do with baking, because flavors, and it has to do with like first generation immigrants maybe? I don't actually know. Immigrant family right there. Her books sound amazing. I've only have this one currently because I want to give this a shot before I give her other books a shot, just in case she's not for me, but I have a very distinct feeling she is going to be for me, so we may see the other 2 before I even touch this one. But yeah, Pride and Prejudice retelling. Those are like the code words for me, and I'm like down. And the next one is Jane in Love by Rachel Givney. This one I believe is relatively new, as like the beginning of this year maybe, but it's what if Jane Austen, the person Jane Austen, was in modern times. So in this book, it takes place kind of in 2 timelines. Obviously, it starts with her, Jane, in England, and she just really wants to be published. She hasn't been published yet. And then somehow she gets transported to modern day on the set of one of her novels being turned into a movie, and she can't believe she's this big writer. Everyone like loves her. She's this huge phenomenon, and so she stays in kind of contemporary time, and I believe she falls for someone who's on set. But because she's staying in contemporary times, she's not in the past, so she's not writing these books, so things start happening and they start disappearing. Ooh, so romance that's kind of like time travel-y, which sounds great. I'm so excited. It's a contemporary mostly, but like, I'm so curious to see what's gonna happen. Because like, is this man gonna follow her to the past? Who knows what's gonna happen, because she clearly has to go back to the past in order for the books to continue. I have many questions. The next one is one that I've read and I love, and that is Longborne by Jo Baker. So this is a reimagining of Pride and Prejudice, but it's from the servant's point of view. So Longborne is the house that the Bennet family lives in during Pride and Prejudice, and like I said, it's from the point of view of the servants, specifically Sarah, who was a maid, and it's all based on one line. One line in Pride and Prejudice. They mention something about a footman, and he never shows up again in the book. It's only like briefly mentioned once. And so Jo Baker decided, you know what? What if there's a reason he doesn't show up again? And so this is all told from Sarah's point of view as this new footman shows up. So it's really cool because it's specifically just based and focuses on the servants and their lives. So the Bennet family plays a part in that, but it's very like, they are not the focus. They just happen to be the employment for these people, but like, it's not at all the focus of the story. But it's really cool because there's hints throughout this book to what's happening in the girls' lives, on what is happening to the family that happened in Pride and Prejudice. So it's just kind of cool to like see nods here and there to the original story, but like this is the main focus, is its own thing, which is very, very cool. So this does take place before, during, and after the events of Pride and Prejudice, but mostly during that story. But it was really great. I really, really enjoyed this book. I thought it was a very interesting idea, a very interesting perspective to be in, because we never see anything about servants really in these novels beyond like the fact that they are there. So it was very cool to see that perspective. But this next one is just silly, and I haven't read it yet, but I really want to, and that is Lost in Austen by Emma Campbell Webster. This is kind of a create your own story where like as you're reading you make decisions, and based on those decisions you're taken to specific pages throughout this book and you kind of create your own story. But it's all about Jane Austen and it surrounds Jane Austen. It says right here on the back, you kind of create your own destiny as Elizabeth, which is just so cool. I like that idea. I've read a few of these kind of create your own stories before. I think they're fascinating because anytime you read them, they're totally different because the decisions you make are different. And I don't know. This just sounds kind of cool. So maybe one day I'll like try this out at some point. But like, I want to be an Austen heroine, and now I can. Kind of. So I lied, there is another mystery, it's just at a different part of my bookshelves, and that is Death Comes to Pemberley by P.D. James. This is another murder mystery story surrounding Pemberley. I have not read this one, but there is a PBS adaptation that used to be on Netflix. I'm not sure if it's still there. It's like a 4-episode adaptation. I've seen that, but it's been a while, so I don't actually remember what happens in this book, but I do believe it takes place 6 years after Elizabeth and Darcy, have been married. And I know that it has to surrounds like Lydia and Wickham, because I feel like they show up at some point. Maybe I'm wrong. I don't know. It's got a lot of the same kind of idea of the Phantom of Pemberley, but this is more like true murder mystery rather than like super dark weird things that happen. I feel like if you like things like Agatha Christie, you'll like this book, if I remember correctly. The next one is another kind of like a reimagining of what happens after Pride and Prejudice, and that is Mr. Darcy Takes a Wife by Linda Birdall. This is so chunky, and like the text is tiny, but I got it for like 50 cents at like a warehouse. And I did it anyway, but like it's the idea of like Pride and Prejudice continued. And the cool thing is I'm reading this book that's all about Jane Austen fandom, and this book is mentioned in it. And I already owned it, so that was kind of cool. But apparently it's super steamy, like super steamy. But she tried to keep it as similar to Jane Austen's writing as she could. I have no idea what happens in this book. It's just their life as married. This is another one that's very, very similar, and that is Mr. and Mrs. Fitzwilliam Darcy by Sharon Lathan. Same idea. It's the idea of like what happens after Darcy and Lizzie have been married. I don't know if it's like, it starts on their wedding day and continues. So that's super curious. It's not as large, but I think the font is very, very similar because it's the same publisher as that one that I just showed you. So who knows? But another one that kind of the idea of like, then what happens next step after they're married? Works for me. The next two I'm going to do together because they're kind of the same idea, but they're by the same author, and that is Confessions of a Jane Austen Addict and Rude Awakenings of a Jane Austen Addict, both by Lori Rigler. This one is the Confessions of a Jane Austen Addict, is if a woman who's obsessed with Jane Austen in modern time somehow gets sent back in time to Regency England, whereas this one is the reverse, the girl in Regency England who gets sent back to modern time. Yeah, that's all I know about them. I was supposed to read this one in March, and I did not do that. But they both sound like they're going to be super funny, super witty, but they're by the same author. They're kind of part of the same series because they're roughly the same idea, just in reverse, and this just sounds like fun. The next two I'm going to do together as well because they're by the same author, and that is The Lost Memoirs of Jane Austen and The Missing Manuscript of Jane Austen by Scribd James. These might be my favorite Jane Austen inspired anything on my shelf. So The Missing Manuscript of Jane Austen follows the idea of if there was a manuscript that Jane Austen wrote but never published and actually hid from the world, and what would happen if you found a clue that led you to that manuscript, and then you read the manuscript. So this book is 80% the actual manuscript, so it's like you are reading a new Jane Austen book, which is very cool. Whereas this one kind of follows the ideas of, what if Jane Austen actually like wrote some memoirs about herself that had been hidden for years and were discovered. So this is written in a way, and the idea that what we're reading here is actually Jane Austen's writing, even though it's not. So I just like the idea of these. These are very well done. I love it. You have to kind of be a huge Jane Austen nerd to like really appreciate these, but they're still so much fun, and I really liked them, and just the idea behind both of them is fascinating. So I love this author. She's fantastic. The next book is for my sci-fi friends out there, and that is the Jane Austen Project by Kathleen A. Flynn. This is the idea of like kind of set in the future, but mostly takes place in the past, where in the future there's this government agency who sends agents back to fix things, find things, you know, X, Y, and Z. And this book follows two agents who are sent back in time to meet, befriend, and actually steal from Jane Austen, because she has hinted in her letters, I think specifically to her sister, that there might be another manuscript out there, and they're sent back to find it, if it does exist. And then what happens if like you actually become really close with your subject, aka Jane Austen, and you become like biffles with her? What happens then? So I read this book a couple of years ago, I want to say. I really enjoyed it. It definitely has the sci-fi feeling to it, because you are these agents, or you're in these agents' mind as they've gone back in time. So you have all the historical stuff, but they are very much thinking modernly, if that's the right word. So I enjoyed this a lot. The next one is another one for my sci-fi friends, and that is We Steal No, The Stars We Steal by Alexa Dawn. This is a reimagining of Persuasion, which, I don't know if you could tell by this entire video, Pride and Prejudice is pretty much like up there as far as like one of my favorites by her, but I also really, really enjoy Persuasion, and there's not very many reimaginings or like things that I've seen that have been inspired by that book specifically. There are so many for Pride and Prejudice. It's like her most famous novel, but not a lot for Persuasion. And this is a sci-fi version of that, and I'm so excited. I haven't read this one yet. This author did a book called Brightly Burning, which is a reimagining of Jane Eyre, which is not even related to Jane Austen, but this kind of takes place in the same idea, the same world, the same kind of like space, because it's the idea of the entire humanity is on ships in space because they had to leave Earth because Earth was uninhabitable. So it's the same idea of like Persuasion, lost love, that kind of thing, but just set in space on spaceships. And I really enjoy this author's writing from the first book. They're not in the same series. They don't have anything to do with each other. You can read one without reading the other. Not a problem. They're just kind of set in the same world, so it's kind of cool to already have an idea of what this world is from the first book. This is very, very sci-fi. So if you are a huge, we live on spaceships, we are from space, that kind of sci-fi, this is your book. And the very last one is super silly. My best friend gave it to me, but I love it so much. And that's this little picture book of Pride and Prejudice. It's made out of cardboard. It's for like infants, but the idea is like it's counting. So like you start with 1 and you go to like, you got 1 English village, you got 2 rich gentlemen, which is Mr. Bingley and Mr. Darcy. So like all the things in this are related to Pride and Prejudice some way, but it is definitely a book for infants. And she found it at like a garage sale or like a Goodwill or something and thought that I needed it, and I very much agreed with her. So one day, hopefully, my future children will have this book in their possession of like just something to love, and I love it so much. It's so silly. There's no point in me, a grown adult of 25, to have this book, but it's great and I love it. So that's a look at the books that I have that have been inspired by Jane Austen and her works. I hope you enjoyed. I hope you took some fun recommendations from this video. If you are a huge Jane Austen fan, or if you're just like a romance fan in general, there's some good recommendations on here. If you like hate to love romance, anything that is based on Pride and Prejudice is your thing. Second chance romance, anything based on Persuasion is your thing. Anything about families, anything about Sense and Sensibility is your thing. So like, there are things for everybody in this. But please let me know down below if you've read any of the books that I mentioned, or if you are a huge Jane Austen fan yourself, anything that you think that has been kind of inspired or based on her or her works. I would love to know. Obviously, I need to add them to my collection. I'm obsessed. But if you like this video, and I very much hope that you did, don't forget to give it a big thumbs up and subscribe down below if you want to be part of this awesome growing family. I've also got all my social medias as well as other fun bookish things down below, so don't forget to go check all of those out. And I'll see you guys in my next video. Bye!